carbs are able to be utilized right away, and you got to wait like 20 to 40 minutes of your training before you're able to really utilize the fat that is in you.
I mean, it's cute, but it's not true. I mean, think about it
Okay.
for yourself, like, I mean, does it take you 40 minutes to start getting your energy?
No, like I feel like I
No.
can go right away.
Yeah, exactly, because you can. The thing is that, he's talking about fat oxidation. This is slightly different than utilizing ketone bodies for energy. Your body can use ketones like that. And so, ketones are derived from your fat and from fat oxidation. But the thing is, you're always doing that. I mean, it doesn't take 40. I mean, if we're starting from, from a vacuum and your organism was just starting up, maybe, but even then, no. You're right now burning fat. You're right now utilizing fat oxidation and ketone bodies for the energy. Every single tissue in your body predominantly will utilize ketones primarily before ketones, even your muscles, but only when ketones are available. So when you have the reason we're running on glucose all the time, we think that glucose is the bee's knees, is because no one has ketones. And so we're studying all these things in the context of people who eat a lot of carbs, you know? And so, your brain feels, oh, you need 120 grams of glucose a day for your brain. No, you don't. You need ketones. When you have ketones available, even if you have an abundance of glucose, your brain will only, two-thirds of your brain will only run on ketones, even though there's an excess of glucose, right? So no glucose, just ketones, right? So that means your brain prefers ketones. That's a clear preference. It's only when the ketones start going down that it starts filling in the gap with glucose. It's a backup energy supply.
Mhm.
Same goes for your heart. Same goes for your intestine. Same goes for all your organs. Same goes for your muscles. So and besides,
Really?
yes. So even if and even if that weren't true, even if you needed to run on glucose or glycogen, you make glucose and glycogen. It's gluconeogenesis. You're making glucose and glycogen all the time. We're both in ketosis. We both haven't had carbs in a while. I haven't had carbs in nearly a decade. My blood sugar is normal. My blood last time I checked, my blood sugar was 84, right? Where'd that come from? Right? You don't need to eat carbs in order to burn carbs. You make carbs. You're predominantly all of your tissue will run on ketones if there are ketones available. And there are a few other things that you use glucose and glycogen for, and you make those in abundance. There's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate, meaning that there is the amount of carbohydrates that you have to consume in order to not die throughout the entire course of your life is 0 grams. That is a well
Crazy.
established fact. There are entire civilizations that have never eaten a carbohydrate in their entire life, right? Like the Inuit, people living in people crossing the land bridge from Asia to North America during the last ice age in the Arctic Circle, 1,500 miles north of what is now Seattle, when Seattle was under a mile-high block of ice, right? What sort of tubers and honey and breakfast cereal were they having up there? It was nothing. They were eating a bunch of like mammoth and walrus and things like that. You know, so um, one of the things that the reason they say this, so you can't have like a high intensity sport, super high athlete, like you said. Okay, yeah, if you're sort of running a marathon, you're at a slower pace, then fine. But if you're really ramping it up, really explosive, then you need carbohydrates. The reason he's saying that, and this is really the reason I know this is what he's talking about is because, or this is like the origins of the people he's talking about and why they're saying that is because it's been around for a while. That when traditionally, when you look at athletes who are carb fueled, right, they're eating carbohydrates. When you get up to about 60% VO2 max, maybe really working hard, but not just killing yourself, right? Um, you're burning fat. This is what I talk about, like that phase two cardio and things like that. You get your heart rate in just this area, and yeah, you're burning fat. And you go past that, then you're burning carbs. So that's what they talk about. If you want to burn fat, you got to stay in this zone right there, right? And
Okay.
so, well, if you want to go more intense, well, then you need carbs. Obviously, you need carbs if you want to be an intense athlete, right? So those studies are with carb fueled athletes. When you've done that with ketogenic
Yeah.
athletes, they find that people are still running on ketones and fat oxidation over 90% VO2 max. And so even then, in those groups, there was a McSweeney, what was it? No, sorry, that was another one I'll get to. The Volek's Faster trial. Volek and Finney published a study in 2016 called the Faster trial. And they looked at Ironman and ultramarathon runners who were like elite world-class guys who had already been doing keto for a long time. They took some other ones that had been, again, world-class that had been doing, just normal carbs, right? And they found that they looked at their VO2 max and they found that the carb group, yeah, certainly it drops down. They're not oxidizing fat after 60%. It's really the peak is around, sort of 50%, 45, 50% VO2 max for peak fat oxidation, which is also a lower peak. And then in the keto group, the fat oxidation peak went way higher and way longer. And so they didn't stop oxidizing fat until around 92% VO2 max. And so you look at the total amount of energy that they used, 90% of it was from fat, right? And then it was
what else would it be? Like at that point, like, okay, so sorry to cut you off, but so you're oxidizing fat as a ketogenic athlete all the way up to 92% VO2
Mhm.
max. What about that less 8%? Then you need the glycogen for that?
Yeah, but you make it. That's all glycogen that they make, glycogen and carbs.
Okay.
Their blood sugar is still right here. And these are
Yeah.
keto
Yeah.
athletes, so they're not sucking down gels and packets and things like that, and sugar water.
Uh-huh.
They're just going. They're just running on their fat, right? That guy Alex
Yeah.
McDonald that ran 5 marathons in 5 days completely fasted, right?
Yeah.
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 Hey everyone, really happy to announce a new sponsor for the show and for everybody down in Australia, Stockman Steaks, who are delivering high quality grass-fed and finished pasture-raised beef and other meats, flash frozen and vacuum sealed to your door, something that I've been enjoying a lot of myself recently as well. They also have a great range of specialty items such as high-fat keto mince and carnivore beef and organs mince with liver, kidneys, and beef heart as well. So use code Chaffee today for a free order of beef mince or another specialty gift along with your order at stockmansteaks.com.au, and I'll see you over there. Thanks, guys. So that's the thing,
Crazy.
like you make blood sugar, you make glycogen. And the really interesting thing about the faster trial is they had them do this 3-hour run, right? So they're on the treadmill just booking out for 3 hours, right? But they did muscle biopsies. So they did a muscle biopsy before the run, after the run, and then 3 hours after the recovery, which is pretty wild. They did a muscle biopsy right before. So they said that, and then they had to run for 3 hours after they just like
Yeah,
did a
that's
biopsy out of their
nuts.
leg. Yeah. So they said it was like,
That's crazy.
it felt like someone was stabbing them in the leg with a pen every step they took for 3 hours, right?
That's fun.
And so in the carb group and the keto group, they looked at their muscle glycogen levels. They were exactly the same at every stage, right? And the carb group was sucking down sugar water, gels, sugar gels, carb packets and things like that. Keto group was just letting their body do its thing. Didn't eat any carbohydrates. And so they had their muscle glycogen, they all started at the same level, even though the keto group didn't carb load. And then after the run, it went down, but they both went down the same degree. In fact, the keto group was slightly above. And then 3 hours later, they both recovered to the same degree, except the keto group didn't use any of it. And the real interesting thing about these trials, and there's several other studies that show very similar results, at least no detriment to going keto. And the
Yeah.
longer you're on keto, the better the performance. And so the keto group starts outperforming once you become keto adapted. Now, there is a transition period, and your body doesn't get used to running on ketones for at least a few weeks. And then more and more as the months go by, it gets better and better and better. And so, you know, um, in those trials where they actually let them keto adapt and they had all these benefits, the keto group was at least performing at the same level or better. And the carb groups, these are elite athletes, right? And then some of them were like weekend warriors. But in the ones with elite athletes, all these guys are like pre-diabetic. Some of them are getting diabetic because the amount of carbs and sugar that they're taking in, it's just killing their metabolism. Yeah, exactly. It's just destroying the
Yeah.
metabolism. Okay, so you're getting performance, Well, we know from randomized controlled crossover trials done by Professor Tim Noakes in South Africa that you don't get any better results. You'll get the same results at most, and you're getting diabetes, and you're getting sick, and your gut's bubbling all the time. You feel like you need to vomit or take a crap in the middle of a fight, which is not a good time to
No,
be
bad
like
time.
feeling like you need to
Bad
go.
time.
And
Yeah.
and you have all these other added problems, and you're not performing any better. So it's not really any benefit. The things that your buddy's probably talking about are things like the Supernova trial, which was done looking at keto and carb athletes. And they found same thing, that VO2 max was way higher, burning a lot more fat further on. But they said, but the actual output, wasn't as good. Like the energy utilization wasn't as good. They weren't able to perform as well. Okay, well, let's examine. So they say, well, it doesn't matter what this, metabolism was. They're not getting the performance. Okay, but let's take a look. They put these guys on a ketogenic diet and then like tested them the next week. So there's no adaptation. They also just said, yeah, have some salt. When you're first adapting to ketogenic diets, your insulin starts coming down and you lose too much salt. So you can get dehydrated. You can get, hyponatremic. You can get, well, it's hard to get fully hyponatremic, but your salt levels can go down, and that will absolutely affect performance as a high level athlete, right? So these guys weren't given enough salt. They weren't controlled for electrolytes, and they didn't have any time to fat adapt, right? Whereas, and
Yeah.
so that's what they found. Wow, they didn't get the same performance. Whereas if you go to the Tim Noakes trial, where he looked at recreational athletes, um, and it was a randomized crossover trial, meaning that they randomized the participants, and one was a keto group, one was a carb group. They let them keto adapt for 6 weeks at least. And then they did all these trials and tried to just crush them and kill them with all these sorts of things and make sure they didn't just have some residual glycogen and things like that, that they were actually running on fat and running at that level. And they did that. So they did a series of 800-meter runs, and they just did 800-meter run after 800-meter run, just again and again and again, just trying to just trash these guys. And they just kept
Yeah.
going, kept going, kept going. And so you're not having any drop, but now you're tapped into your fat, and your fat, you have way more energy in your fat because your when you have let's say you have a 65 kilo individual, right? 6% body fat, elite athlete, right? That that little dude can maximally with maximum carb loading, can stuff in his liver and his muscles about 2,400 kilocalories of energy. Okay, it's about a day's worth of energy. So if you're doing really high
Yeah.
level sort of exercise, you're gonna burn through that, you know. But that
Yeah.
same 65 kilo individual with only 6% body fat, super lean, that 6% body fat has over 35,000 kilocalories of energy. It's over 15 times the amount of energy, because that is our main uh, fuel source. That's our
Yeah.
storage form of energy. It's the most efficient, and you can just see it right there. Maximal glycogen storage 2,400 versus 15 times that in 6% body fat, right? And if you're bigger than that, or you have more body fat than that, you've got more energy than that, and now you're tapped in.
Mm.
When you eat carbohydrates, it locks that off. You can only run on your glycogen now, because if insulin is up, you cannot burn fat. Insulin blocks lipolysis, which is the breakdown and degradation of fat for energy. Okay, so you can't use that, right? So these guys that they're doing the keto group in Tim Noakes' trial, like they're still performing at the same level, they're still able to put the same output, but they don't ever stop. They don't need to refuel. They don't need carbs. They don't need sugar. They don't need sports drinks, right? And they had no drop in performance. And then they flipped them. So it's a crossover trial. So the keto group became the
Yeah.
carb group, and the carb group went keto and gave them, or it was like a 2 week washout period, eat whatever you want. And then they went again 6 weeks keto. And again, no drop in the performance, right? So with at least 6 weeks, we know there's no drop in performance. Supernova didn't
Mm.
give them 2 weeks, you know? And so, you're just not fat adapted at that point, and the
Yeah.
electrolytes and the dehydration and all these other sorts of things. There's a lot of flaws with that study. Then you get specifically
Okay.
for explosive. You want to go to the McSweeney trial in 2018, where they had a group of, again, elite world class athletes. Ironman ultra marathoners, they self-selected into a keto or carb group. So they chose which one they went into, which one they wanted to do. And they gave them 3 months to adapt, so 12 weeks to adapt, right? So a good long period of time. And they did 3 trials. They did a 100-mile run, so big ass run, a six
That's
second
yeah.
sprint, and then a critical power test like a sort of really high intensity um, anaerobic, sort of highly sustained anaerobic output, so heavy like weights, all that sort of stuff, right? So that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And and the keto group outperformed the carb group in all three. The last
Wow.
two came to statistical significance. The 100-mile run didn't come to statistical significance, but the trend was they all beat them, right?
Okay.
But just with statistics, it's just you call it statistically significant. It could have been a fluke sort of thing. The other two
Yeah.
were
Yeah.
statistically significant. So
Wild. The
yeah, so
explosive
for
ones.
the explosive ones, so for the critical power test, the anaerobic sustained anaerobic test, and the sprint, the 6 second sprint, the keto group beat the other side. That's statistically significant. So specifically for explosive sports, we know that this is better. Now, how good is any study? They all have flaws. This one had,
Mm.
20 or so participants. Would we have gotten different results with 500? Well, maybe that's what statistical significance is about. When you say something statistically significant, it's less likely to be a fluke, right? And so if we
Mm.
did this with 500 people, we should see the same results. That's what statistically
Mm.
significant means. So you need to have enough people to make that work, and they did. But yeah, so specifically the explosive power um, came to statistical significance. So, I mean, I understand where he's coming from because that's the old teaching, and that's just the traditional
Yeah.
teaching. But it's being upended. Tim Noakes is one of the top exercise physiologists and sports medicine doctors in the world. He wrote books about this, about high intensity training, working with national teams, and world class athletes. He was a top marathon runner himself, and all of a sudden he woke up one day and he's like super fit, writing books on how to be a badass, and he's diabetic, and he's a doctor, and he's an athlete.
Crazy.
And it's like, whoa, what the hell's going on? And he realized that he'd been wrong this whole time. And so now he's basically spending his retirement years undoing his entire legacy about how you need carbs as an elite athlete. And he's saying, no, you
Wow.
don't. He's saying, like I feel like I've been lying to people for the last 30 years because it's just wrong. And so now this research is coming out. The before it just got regurgitated and repeated, and so that was just what it was. That was a dogma. Everyone's doing that. All the top athletes are eating carbs, so obviously you have to eat carbs. Well, no, it's just they were told to eat carbs, and so they eat carbs. But they're all having gut issues. They're all having chronic disease issues. They're all getting freaking diabetic. You know, and so that's not actually helping. But you get some and people say the total opposite. Other times they'll say, well, sure, like in sprinting or rugby, because I played professional rugby for 10 years before medical school. 5 of those years were ketogenic carnivore, and I've never felt better in my entire life. I mean, it's hands down. It was just night and day. And so they'll say, well, yeah, sure, but so maybe for rugby or like sprinting or something like that, but for the endurance things, you have to have carbs. You have to have carbs. You have to be taking down gels, and no one's in the Tour de France that's on keto. Like, well, actually, there's a guy named Chris Froome who actually won the Tour de France 4 times, and he's keto. That's funny, And I was like, well, the high intensity sort of fighting, it never worked. I was like, really? Because there's UFC fighters right now that are not only keto but full carnivore. There's a Wilton Ziegler and a female fighter named Marina Moroz. They're both carnivore. They're both
Uh,
openly carnivore, and they're both UFC fighters, right? Um, and well, and I don't know about Wilton. I think he's in the UFC, but anyway, he's a pro MMA fighter, and so I mean, there's I did a whole laundry list of top athletes that are all carnivore. And when you get back into it too, we'll add you to the list as well.
Sick. Yes. Yes. That will be very shortly. Probably this
Yeah.
summer. Probably this
Nice.
summer. And one of the things that I really wanted to leverage with this diet is the ability to compete more often.
Hmm.
Now I wanted to bring up the TBI, and hopefully you're able to shed some light on how this kind of a diet will help you to absorb damage more,
Hmm.
right? Like decreasing inflammation and helping in recovery. Like I feel that in my last two fights, right? Like I fought Islam Makhachev and then I fought Rustam Khabilov, both from Team Eagle, same team as Khabib, both trained by
Hmm.
Khabib's dad. I
Hmm.
fought them 5 weeks apart, and my early career, all my fights were very close together. Like I fought like
Hmm.
9 times in my first year. But as I went on, I would have big layoffs, and most times you want to really make sure that you're prepped for each camp individually. So I wouldn't put fights back to back, and I would be like a lot of times like 4 months or 6 months out of the cage before my next fight. And then going back to back in that last fight, they went back to back 5 weeks out, which isn't even really
Hmm.
that close, but it's a lot closer than it normally was. And
Hmm.
I felt so comfortable in the cage. I
Nice.
felt like it was very, very normal, right? Like it was just another day, like I was just here. It didn't feel like big and grandiose, and it was able to lock in a lot better. And so I'm figuring like if I'm able to get into competition shape and go compete, like as long as I'm not savagely injured from the competition, like I'm just gonna book another one and like fight it in a couple of weeks and then book another one and fight it in another couple of weeks. And I I think that I'll actually be able to do it because of this diet. Like this
Hmm.
diet is gonna really help me to be back in the cage quickly.
Yeah. No, yeah, it definitely can. I mean, obviously, you get like little bumps and bruises and like injuries and things like that. Like you might need a little more time to rehab it, but your muscles will recover. Absolutely. You know, like that will
What
all
about your
recover.
brain? What about like okay, I get punched in the head a bunch of times. Uh,
Take some time off.
what's the difference in the brain?
Hey guys, just want to take a second to thank our sponsor, Carnivore Bar. I don't promote many products because honestly, all you need to be healthy is to just eat meat. For those times that you're out hiking, road tripping, or stuck at work and you want a nutritious snack that is just meat, fat, and salt if you want it, the Carnivore Bar is a great option. So I like this product not because it's just pure meat, but also because I want the carnivore market to thrive as well. And the more we support meat-only products, the more meat-only products there will be available in the mainstream. So if this sounds like something you'd like to get behind, check it out using my discount code Anthony to get 10% off, which also applies to subscriptions, giving you 25% off total. All right, thanks guys.
Yeah. Well, I was also going to say too, I also remembered, one of the Gracies are doing carnivore too, Holland Gracie. He runs Gracie
Oh,
Jiu-Jitsu
okay.
in San Francisco. I had him on the podcast as well. He's been doing carnivore for a few years now as well. He says it's a game changer. He just feels absolutely amazing, doing that. So, there are top fighters in the world that are doing this, and they're specifically saying, explicitly saying that this has launched their game, that they feel much better. These are top level world class athletes, and they're saying this made it a lot better, right? So, yeah, you can put your buddy's mind at ease, and also remember, just wear his ass out, and he'll know. It's like it doesn't matter what a book says,
Yeah.
doesn't matter what the studies say or anything like that. If you
Yeah.
just go out there and just wear his ass out, and it's like, well, okay, I mean, I can't. I've seen this for myself. You're not lacking any energy. Um, but yeah, it's really important, point with the TBIs and the injuries. If you have, there's certain rules, like called the SCAT rules. They have new versions, every few years. But they're the concussion rules for, going back into contact sport, certainly for combat
Yeah.
sport. You need to take a certain amount of time off if you have like a diagnosed concussion. And you could argue that unless you really just don't get hit and you win a really clean victory, you're probably going to have some form of concussion coming out of any fight, you know. And so you should probably, think about that and at least take some time off. If you have a back concussion where you're sort of wobbly on your feet and you're having can't really sort of, spell world backwards and remember, 3 items that, 3 minutes later, something like
Yeah.
that. You're going to need like 23 days off from anything, like no training, no running, no anything. You need to rest because your brain needs to rest. And so you don't want to get your blood pressure up. You don't even want to like think too hard. You want your brain to rest. You want to go to like a yoga retreat and just zen out for a few weeks. and certainly not go back into contact sports, but you really shouldn't be training either if you have a concussion like that, and that can be diagnosed with these SCAT criteria that anybody can look up online. And but the advantages of from a combat perspective and a concussion perspective is that when you get a concussion, there's the initial damage, but then your brain actually continues to swell. Actually, you get neuroinflammation, and your brain starts to swell and get more damaged because of that swelling. So now it's swelling and it's pushing on things and it's sort of crushing itself with its swelling. Not so much that you're going to die unless there's like a bleed, unless there's something like really wrong. So if you had like a very serious injury, sometimes the brain can really, really swell up. But that's rare. But with like severe head injuries, sometimes you can get that, and you even have to do like a decompressive craniectomy where you actually take off the side of the skull and let it just swell out there for a while. I've had to do that surgery many a time at
that's
2 a.m.
You're a brain surgeon.
Yeah.
Wild.
So, well, I'm not a brain surgeon, but looking to become one. And so, but because I've been there for a while, and I've done this. You operate independently for certain things, and certainly the traumas like that is something that I did quite frequently on my own, and so you have to do that. So would be very unlikely to get that unless you got a real bad knockout or something like that. But either way, you get these concussions, and the brain will swell to a certain degree, and that can cause more damage with that swelling. And so for the next 48 hours, this thing is swelling up and swelling up and swelling up, and you're getting more and more damage after the fact. Well, the thing is that ketones are actually anti-inflammatory. They block something called the NLRP3 inflammasome. And so they go up into your brain. And remember, your brain optimally runs on ketones. So this is better fuel for your brain anyway. Now your brain's not struggling to use some like crappy glucose. Now it's running on ketones, clean burning, and also that's suppressing inflammation. So it's actually bringing down that swelling. And so it's not enough to stop eating carbs once you've had a concussion. You need to be in ketosis at the time of concussion so that your ketones are already up, so that you're suppressing that inflammation. And so, it's still sort of in preliminary days, and this isn't like we don't have like necessarily hard data on this. It's still kind of mechanistic, and we have some preliminary data on this, that this can help with concussion recovery and not allowing the brain to get even more damaged post-concussion, because there's two injuries again, the concussion itself and then the swelling injury. So, one thing that you can do, in some studies shown this, like especially with animals, that you're giving exogenous ketones that can sort of bring down that swelling, but you'd have to take exogenous ketones every 2 hours. And I would do that if I weren't in ketosis, or if someone was, I'd say, oh, look, just take for every 2 hours while you're awake, take this, and then, when you're sleeping, you're going to get, the swelling's going to come up, and then you get back on it. But that can help. But you need to be in ketosis at the time. You'll cut out a lot of your water weight. And so you'll be pretty dry all the time. You could drink less water and all that sort of stuff and actually get fully dehydrated, but, you won't be retaining water, And so, you'll notice that when you check your weight, it's much more consistent.